This video is brought to you by Ground News. When Turkey finally started raising interest rates in 2023, there was hope that Turkey's economy was finally on the path to normality, after years of ruthless inflation and currency depreciation thanks to President Recep Erdogan's unorthodox monetary policies. However, nearly 2 years later, normality seems a long way off. Inflation is still running at 40%. The central bank had to restart its rate hike cycle earlier this year, and in the past couple of weeks, the lira has resumed its apparently never-ending decline, nearing an all-time low of 40 to the dollar. So in this video, we're going to take another look at Turkey's economy, and why the lira is still falling. We're getting ever closer to 1 million subscribers, and 68% of you haven't even subscribed yet. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's start with a quick recap. The lira began declining around 2018, but the slide accelerated rapidly after the pandemic, when inflation ticked up across the world. Usually, central banks hike interest rates to reduce inflation, but Erdogan did the opposite, cutting rates and sacking any central banker who dared oppose him. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work. The lira halved in value against the dollar between 2018 and 2020, then halved again between 2020 and 2022, before the central bank intervened to stabilise it at just under 20 lira to the dollar in early 2023. At the same time, inflation skyrocketed, peaking at about 85% year-on-year in late 2022, according to official data. At the time, Erdogan claimed it was because interest rates are un-Islamic, but given he's since U-turned, it's safe to assume this wasn't the real reason. Rather, it looks like Erdogan didn't want to raise interest rates and slow the economy down before the May 2023 presidential election, which is why the central bank intervened just before the election to stabilise the lira at about 19 to the dollar, despite the fact that defending the lira's position required burning through billions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves. However, once the election was over and Erdogan had secured another term in office, he quickly U-turned, appointing Mehmet Şimşek as finance minister and Hafize Gaye Erkan as central bank governor. Both Şimşek and Erkan were considered safe hands. They'd both made it clear in the past that they disagreed with Erdogan's unorthodox monetary policies, and they'd both spent a lot of their careers at big Western banks. The two duly raised interest rates from 8.5% in May 2023 to 50% by March 2024, where rates stayed for the best part of a year. Originally, it looked like this was sort of working. Inflation started falling pretty steadily from June 2024, and the lira stabilised at around 32 to the dollar at about the same time, despite the fact that the central bank was actually spending lira to buy up foreign currency and bolster its reserves, which would have put downward pressure on the lira. However, in the past couple of months, progress had stalled. Inflation had settled at around 38% year-on-year since February, and month-on-month inflation has actually risen from about 2% to 3% in April, forcing the central bank to unexpectedly raise interest rates from 42.5% to 46%. This is in large part because the lira has resumed its slide, going from 32 to the dollar a year ago to a record low of 39 to the dollar today. So, what's going on here? Well, the proximate trigger of the lira's recent slide, or at least the acceleration we saw earlier this year, was Erdogan's crackdown on opposition media and politicians, including most notably Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, the main opposition party's presidential candidate who currently polls ahead of Erdogan. The crackdown and the prospect of Erdogan becoming president for life spooked international investors, who had tentatively returned to Turkey after the appointment of Şimşek and Erkan in 2023, triggering a slide in the lira that was only halted when the central bank stepped in. But there are at least 5 other exacerbating factors at play here. First, Turkey and the lira have also been hit by the economic uncertainty created by Trump's tariffs, which has caused investors to withdraw from riskier assets, like the lira or lira-denominated bonds, in favour of so-called safe haven assets like gold. Second, it's worth noting that, while a 46% interest rate might sound stupidly high, it's not that much higher than Turkey's current inflation rate of about 40%, which means the real interest rate, that is, the interest you'd get on a lira deposit once you take inflation into account, is actually only about 5 or 6%. Third, the central bank spent much of 2024 spending billions of lira to buy up foreign currency to rebuild its foreign exchange reserves, which had been depleted by its defense of the lira in 2023. At the time, this didn't seem like a bad idea. There was tons of foreign currency flowing into Turkey as a consequence of so-called carry trades, which basically involve borrowing a currency with a low interest rate, then using that currency to buy a different currency with a higher interest rate, making a return that's roughly equivalent to the difference between the two rates. In this case, investors were borrowing dollars or euros and buying up liras to take advantage of the higher interest rates. Because interest rates were so high, this became a stupidly popular trade, and in mid-2024, the central bank was actually worried that the popularity of this carry trade would trigger a rapid and potentially destabilizing appreciation in the lira. This is why the central bank felt confident selling lira to buy foreign currency. They thought it was a good way of keeping the lira stable, but in retrospect, it looks like they were a bit too confident here. And once foreign investors started pulling out after Erdogan's crackdown, this excess of liras ended up stoking inflation and putting yet more downwards pressure on the currency. Fourth, things haven't been helped by Erdogan's persistently loose fiscal policy. Turkey ran a budget deficit representing about 5% of GDP in 2023 and 2024, far higher than most middle-income countries. And while the government has said it wants to bring the deficit back down to 3 or 4% of GDP in 2025, the first few months of this year don't bode well. In normal terms, borrowing rose by 25% year on year in the first quarter. Persistent deficits essentially mean the government is pumping more lira and more demand into the economy, putting downward pressure on the lira and stoking inflation. But the fifth and perhaps most important issue here is that ordinary Turkish people just don't believe that Erdogan is actually going to get a handle on inflation anytime soon. You can see this just by looking at inflation expectations. The latest data from the Turkish Statistical Institute, for instance, suggests that households expect inflation to be at 60% in a year's time. In a sense, this is sort of unsurprising. After all, year-on-year inflation has been running above 30% for nearly 4 years, and Erdogan has proved uniquely bad at bringing prices down. Anyway, this is bad news for Erdogan and co, because high inflation expectations can actually create higher inflation, by making businesses more likely to preemptively raise prices and workers more likely to preemptively demand higher wages. If this is the case, then it looks like Erdogan's turn to monetary orthodoxy might be too little too late. Persistent inflation has anchored Turkish inflation expectations on the high end, which means interest rate hikes won't be enough, and Erdogan will have to somehow convince ordinary Turks that he can get inflation under control. If you want to know more about this topic, there's plenty of other outlets reporting about this online. Unfortunately, it's sometimes hard to tell exactly which way these outlets lean politically, making it difficult to understand exactly how your view of the world is being biased by the sources you're reading. That's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. Their website and app, developed by a former NASA engineer, allows us to pull back the curtain on media bias and have a look at exactly how each story has been covered. For instance, this story about Erdogan's crackdown on the opposition has been covered by more than 353 sources. We know that more than 65 of those have been reported by the left, and more than 35 of those have been reported by the right. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of genuinely useful features. Take their blind spot feed, for instance. This shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean right, you probably missed this story on a more recent spate of arrests by Turkish authorities surrounding Imamoglu's ongoing graft case. Here at TLDR News, we think that Ground News is an incredibly useful tool for our current media landscape, one that's constantly trying to attract your attention and sway you towards or away from certain political viewpoints. Having a tool that helps you spot this and helps you take action really is a game changer. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. This limited time offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.